The heat came off the flattened earth in slow, visible waves that summer, bending the tree line at the edge of Carver County into something that looked like a fever dream, and every person seated in the folding chairs outside the Grange Hall that August afternoon had stopped fanning themselves because the effort cost more than the relief delivered. They sat still, and they waited, and what they were waiting for was a young woman named Delia Marsh to say a single word. Just one word was all they needed from her. That word was yes, or something close to it. 163 people, some of whom had not spoken to Delia Marsh with any kindness in 2 full years, were now watching her the way parched ground watches a cloud. She stood at the head of the folding table with her hands loose at her sides, her hair pinned back without ceremony, and the grime of the week's work still in the creases of her knuckles, and she looked out at the faces and said nothing for long enough that the silence became its own kind of weather. The man to her left, a compact fellow in a pressed linen blazer who had arrived from Meridian Capital Partners 14 months ago and who had never once sweated visibly through any shirt he owned, cleared his throat and gave her a smile that was the professional cousin of patience. He had a folder open on the table in front of him. He had a number written on a notepad. He was confident in the number. He had been confident in every number he had ever written, and every number had served him. Delia looked at the folder. She looked at the number. She looked back at the 163 people who had once decided, in the way communities decide things without holding a meeting, that she was the wrong kind of woman making the wrong kind of bet in the wrong kind of place. And she thought about what old Przemek Dobrowolski had told her one afternoon in his kitchen when the world smelled like turned earth and linden tea. He had set his cup down and looked at her with his small, pale eyes and said, "The land does not hurry, but it does not forget. It keeps its books in layers. You only have to be patient enough to read them." Delia had written that down in the small notebook she kept in her jacket pocket. She had read it back to herself on the bad nights. She was reading it back to herself right now, standing at the head of that table, while 163 people held their breath in the August heat. The real decision, though, she knew, had not been made today. It had been made 22 months ago on a cold March morning, when she had stood alone in a frozen field of 7 acres and tried to calculate whether she had enough left to eat while the ground thawed. The answer had been barely. Barely was the word her life had handed her, and she had built everything she now had on top of it. She had arrived in Carver County in the first week of March, 2 years and 5 months before that August afternoon, with $11,000 in a joint savings account she had just finished converting to her own name, a truck with 140,000 miles on it, and a deed to a 7-acre parcel on the county's eastern margin that her father, James Marsh, had purchased 13 years ago as part of a larger land transaction and then essentially forgotten about, which was why her stepmother Ruth Ann had not bothered to contest the bequest when the estate was settled. Ruth Ann had taken the house in town, the equipment shed, the furniture, the good car, and the savings bonds. She had taken the silver and the riding mower and the dog. She had taken, with exquisite precision, everything that had an obvious number attached to it, everything that could be converted into county gossip and neighborhood esteem. The 7-acre parcel on the eastern margin had no number anyone recognized. The county assessor's office valued it at $9,000, which was less than the truck. The field had not been farmed in 11 years. The topsoil had been stripped by erosion along one whole face of it, leaving a gray clay pan that cracked into tile work in the summer. There was a low spot in the northwest corner where water pooled in spring and bred mosquitoes until July. There were field stones the size of bread loaves distributed across it in apparent randomness. The fence posts that remained were rotted to punk at the ground. There was no well, no structure, no electrical connection. There was a shed foundation, poured and then abandoned by someone before her father had bought the land, its concrete crumbling at the corners. When the county appraiser had walked it 7 years ago, he had written in his notes, marginal dryland, steep remediation cost, limited commodity potential, in the casual shorthand of a man disposing of something. Ruth Ann, who was thorough, had read that appraisal before the estate closed. She had left Delia the field in the spirit of a last insult wrapped in legal paper, the way a person might bequeath a coat that no longer fits and that they have always found ugly. She had expected Delia to sell it immediately and get whatever small relief $9,000 could buy a 27-year-old woman who had no husband, no local connections, and a degree in environmental soil science from a mid-tier state university that had never impressed anyone at any dinner table. That was what Ruth Ann had expected, and what Ruth Ann had expected had been the pivot of her error, because Delia had not sold it. Delia had read the county appraiser's notes the same night she received them, sitting in her car outside the attorney's office, and she had read them the way her training had taught her to read land descriptions, which is to say, not as verdicts, but as symptoms, and what the notes described to her practiced eye was not waste, but history, not exhaustion, but suppression, not marginal dryland, but a parcel whose problems were sequential and correctable, and whose clay subsoil, the very feature the appraiser noted as disqualifying, suggested to her the possible presence of something else entirely. She did not share this reading with anyone. She drove to the eastern margin of Carver County on a Tuesday in early March, parked outside the rotting fence, and walked the 7 acres for 4 hours in the cold, and by the time she got back to her truck, she had made a decision that would cost her almost all of the $11,000 and would require her to sleep in the truck for 6 weeks while she built enough shelter to be out of it. She had a notebook, and she had numbers, and the numbers said barely, but barely had always been the number she worked with, and she had learned in her father's house and in her coursework and in the solitary early hours of more mornings than she could count, that barely was not nothing. Barely was a door left open. She spent $4,200 in the first 60 days. She bought seed of a particular variety, a deep-rooted perennial legume mixture that her thesis advisor had used in a remediation study, expensive per pound but transformative over multiple seasons, and she bought enough to cover 2 acres of the clay pan. She bought 60 linear feet of lightweight plastic fencing, second-hand posts, and a used hand auger for the post holes. She bought a 12 by 16-foot canvas wall tent with a wood stove, and she set it on the old shed foundation, which was sound enough at its center despite the crumbled corners, and she heated it with deadfall she cleared from the fence margins. She ate eggs she bought by the flat from a farm stand 8 miles west. She ate rice and canned beans and the occasional piece of pork shoulder she made last 4 days at a time. She had $6,800 remaining and a mental ledger she updated every Sunday evening by lantern light, running the columns in the notebook she kept in her pocket, tracking every expenditure against the arithmetic of her survival, which was the phrase she used for it in her own head. The arithmetic of survival, not a dramatic phrase for her, but a practical one, the way you might call a lever rather than a miracle, even when it lifts something that seemed unliftable. The arithmetic of survival said she had approximately 19 weeks before the money was gone, and 19 weeks was spring, and spring was what she needed. The town of Harlan Crossing, which was the nearest incorporated place of any size, 4 miles west down the county road, made its verdict about Delia Marsh with the swift efficiency communities reserved for people who arrive alone and acquire something everyone considers worthless. She became, in the shorthand of the feed store and the diner counter and the post office queue, the girl from the eastern margin who bought the dead field. This was not said cruelly in all cases. In some cases it was said with a kind of fond bewilderment, as you might describe someone who has purchased a boat in a landlocked county. In other cases it was said with amusement, the operative joke being that the field was so poor it had rejected 3 previous owners, and would shortly reject a 4th. In the case of Harlow Brandt, who ran Brandt Agricultural Solutions out of a suite of offices above the farm supply on Main Street, it was said with a patient, proprietary warmth that served as a container for something considerably colder. Harlow Brandt appeared at the Eastern Margin property on a Friday morning in late March, arriving in a silver company truck with the logo on the door, and he stood at the fence with a coffee thermos and a smile, and told Delia that he had heard she'd taken on the old Kessler parcel, which was what the locals called it for an owner who had given up on it 16 years ago, and he wanted her to know that he had considerable experience with Eastern Margin ground in this county, and he would be glad to take the parcel off her hands at a price that would let her start fresh somewhere more forgiving, and he named a number, which was $10,000, $1,000 more than the assessment framed as generosity, offered with the voice of a man doing a favor. And Delia looked at him for a moment and then said, "I appreciate that, Mr. Brandt, but I'm not selling." He smiled again, the same smile, as if she hadn't spoken, and said that the offer stood whenever she was ready, and that the Eastern Margin ground was hard country, and she shouldn't feel any shame in reading a situation clearly. And she thanked him again and returned to her fence post. He drove away, and she did not watch him go because she was already thinking about the next post hole and the one after that. It was Przemek Dobrowolski who arrived without announcement on a Wednesday in April, walking down the county road on a late afternoon when the light was still good and the soil she had turned along the south edge was warming visibly, a 74-year-old man in rubber boots and a canvas coat who had farmed the 40 acres abutting her north fence line for 31 years, and who had, in 31 years, spoken approximately 900 words to any neighbor. He stopped at the fence and looked at what she was doing with an expression that was neither approval nor criticism, but genuine attention, which was already more than most people had given her, and then he said, "You are planting the deep-rooted kind." And she said yes. And he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "My father did this in Poland, on the bad ground, on the ground that the landlord left him, because no one wanted it, and he said, 'The bad ground remembers worse things than we do, and it knows how to come back if you stop fighting it and start listening to it. The land does not hurry, but it does not forget. It keeps its books in layers. You only have to be patient enough to read them.'" He came back 3 weeks later with a jar of cold beet soup and a piece of information about the northeast corner of her parcel, something he had observed over 31 years of working the adjacent ground, something that would matter to her very much when the time was right, and he gave it to her without ceremony, the way a careful person passes something breakable, and she received it the same way. The boy's name was Cale Prewitt. He was 9 years old, the second of 4 children belonging to the Prewitt family, who leased a double-wide 3/4 of a mile east on a road that had no name on any map. He appeared at her fence post on a Saturday in May without explanation, watched her work for a full hour without speaking, and then asked if he could carry the seed bag. She handed it to him. He carried it. He came back on Sunday and the Sunday after that, and by June he was arriving on weekday afternoons after school with his younger sister, sometimes behind him, and his pockets full of the interesting stones he collected from her field as she cleared them, which he arranged in a row along the top of the fence post nearest the road. He never asked questions that weren't useful. He named the 3 rabbits that had taken up residence under the shed foundation Copernicus, Meridian, and Stump, for reasons he did not explain and which she did not ask about. And the name seemed correct for the rabbits, which was a quality she had noticed in children who paid attention, that their namings tended toward accuracy rather than sentiment. He told her one afternoon in June, while they were tamping posts on the east line, that his father said she was wasting her time, and that everybody said she was wasting her time, and then he picked up the next post and set it in the hole she had dug and held it steady while she tamped without another word on the subject, which was, she thought, as complete a declaration of allegiance as she had ever received. The visible change in the clay pan sections came in the 2nd July, 14 months in, and it came slowly, the way all things that have been suppressed come back, not as a proclamation, but as an accumulation of small evidences. The legume cover she had planted was in its second season, and the roots had begun their structural work below the surface, fracturing the clay and building pore space. And what had been a gray tilework of cracks in the dry season was showing, at its center, the dark signature of organic matter returning. She crouched in that field alone on a Tuesday morning and pressed her fingers into the soil at the edge of the cover stand, and felt what she had been waiting 14 months to feel, which was the faint give of a soil beginning to open its structure. And she did not celebrate because there was nothing yet to celebrate, but she felt something settle in her chest that had been standing upright and tense for a very long time. She was banking this, she understood. She was keeping the coal low under ash, adding to it quietly, not because she was secretive by nature, but because she had learned, with exact tuition, what happened when you showed people a thing before the thing was finished. They assessed it by what it had been, rather than what it was becoming, and their assessment became a kind of weight on the growing thing. So she kept it. The discovery that made the difference was not the soil remediation, though the remediation was real and would matter in time. The discovery was what Przemek Dobrowolski had told her to look for in the northeast corner when the second spring came and the ground was soft enough to read. She went there on an April morning in her second year with a soil probe and a patience she had been practicing since childhood, and she found at a depth of 14 feet, beneath the old clay pan, beneath the fractured shale layer that had stopped every previous owner and appraiser from looking any further, a saturated sand and gravel lens that was drawing from the same aquifer that fed the wells of every productive farm in the eastern margin of Carver County. 14 feet. A hand-drilled well at 14 feet was a week's work and $2,000 in materials. An aquifer connection at 14 feet in a summer county that had been watching its water table drop for 6 years was not an inconvenience solved. It was a calculation entirely rewritten. It was the arithmetic of survival discarded and replaced by the arithmetic of sufficiency, and sufficiency felt, to Delia Marsh, like a room she had never been allowed into before, and that she entered on her knees without any noise because it was that kind of room. She drilled the well in 3 days, working from 4 in the morning until the light failed, Cale Prewitt holding the lamp for the evening hours until his mother called him home. She did not tell anyone in Harlan Crossing what she had found. She kept the coal under the ash. She kept it for 7 months. The outside validation came in a form she had not anticipated, which was the best way for such things to come. A man named Grigor Tellis, who ran a small specialty vegetable and herb operation in the eastern half of the state and who had been following an agricultural extension article about deep-rooted legume remediation on clay substrates, drove down the county road in October of Delia's second year and stopped at her fence because he recognized the cover crop species from the article, and he asked her what her soil organic matter percentage had tested at, and she told him. And he was quiet for a moment in the way that meant the number had surprised him on the right side, and he asked whether she was planning to plant anything on it, and she told him what she was planning, and he asked her what she would charge for a first-season contract on whatever she could put into the 2 south acres of remediated ground, and she named a number, and he said yes to the number immediately, which told her the number had been too low, but she had named it, and she held it, because the contract itself was worth more to her than the extra margin, and the contract was $1,200 up front and the balance on delivery, and it was the first dollar that had not come from her dwindling reserve in 22 months. She spent 11 minutes being happy about it, standing in the field with the October light coming sideways across the new cover, and then she went back to work. The drought arrived in the following June, the 3rd summer of her time in Carver County, and it arrived the way Przemek Dobrowolski described it when he came to her fence 2 weeks after the last rain and shook his head and said, This is the kind of dry that has a memory. It will not be over in September. He had seen this pattern in Europe as a boy and in Kansas as a young man, and in Carver County twice in 30 years, and he was right about the memory. By July, the county road ran through a landscape the color of old bone. The creek that bisected the Harlan Crossing Township had gone to a thread and then to pools and then to nothing. The Prewitt family's well dropped below pump reach in the last week of July, which meant Cale came to the eastern margin field every evening with 2 5-gallon jugs, and Delia filled them from the hand pump without comment, because Cale had held the lamp for her, and because the Prewitts had 4 children, and because water is not a negotiation. The established farms in the county with drilled wells were managing, but the shallower operations were failing fast, and the livestock in the county that required surface water were in trouble. And the Grange Hall was full on Tuesdays for the first time in years, because people were frightened in the particular way that people who have built their lives around a thing that is now absent become frightened, which is a fear with no clear address. Harlow Brant moved like a man who had been waiting for this. He had been making quiet acquisitions for 2 years, purchasing water rights adjacent to parcels where the owners were stretched thin, offering buyouts to dry operations that looked distressed, framing each transaction in the language of assistance and relief. He had a consortium behind him which he did not exactly advertise, but did not deny. And the consortium had developed a supply and distribution model for bulk water under a use agreement he had been assembling parcel by parcel along the county's main aquifer corridor. By August, he had enough pieces that the model was nearly functional, and what the model required to be fully functional was the northeast corner of Delia Marsh's 7-acre parcel, which sat at the upstream end of the corridor and whose aquifer connection, he now knew with specificity, was the primary recharge point for the whole lens. He knew this with a specificity that Delia noticed the moment he named it, a specificity that quoted depths and flow rates he could not have arrived at through any survey he had access to, because she had filed no permits and disclosed no tests, and the only people who had been on that parcel were herself and Cale Prewitt and Przemek Dobrowolski. She kept her face neutral when he quoted the number and stored the information in the part of her that kept things. He came to the property in the second week of August, arriving this time in a different truck, the consortium's regional vehicle, a larger thing with more logo on the door, and he had a partner with him, and a folder, and the folder contained a new number. The number was $41,000 for the parcel in full, plus a 5-year water use agreement that would deliver Delia a fee of $300 per month for access to the aquifer infrastructure he would install on her land. He presented this as remarkable generosity in the context of a $9,000 assessed parcel, and it was remarkable in that light, and he expected her to understand it as remarkable. She looked at the folder for the length of time it took her to do the arithmetic, which was not very long, and the arithmetic said that the consortium's infrastructure investment and their projected distribution revenue over 5 years put the value of the water rights she held at between $600,000 and $800,000, against which $41,000 was not generosity, but arithmetic of a different kind, the kind that depends on the other party not knowing how to read it. She set the folder back on the tailgate and said, "I appreciate you coming out, Mr. Brant, and I will let you know." He said he was glad to hear it, and that in these times a person had to be practical, and that offers of this size had a way of not lasting once the crisis resolved itself. And she said she understood that, and she thanked him again, and he drove away. She watched him go this time. That evening she walked the northeast corner of her parcel for a long time with a flashlight after dark, and then she sat on the old shed foundation steps and wrote 4 columns of numbers in her notebook until the arithmetic was clear, and then she walked down the county road to Przemek Dobrowolski's kitchen and knocked on the door. And he opened it and looked at her and said, "Come in," And he put the kettle on, and she sat at the table and told him what Brant had offered and what the flow rate figure Brant had quoted told her about who had been on her land. And Zemek was quiet for a while, and then he said, "This is the bad man's final move. When they offer you the number that sounds large but is small, they have already decided you will not understand the difference. You have to show them you do." She asked him what he thought she should do. He poured the tea and thought for a long time. He said, "The land does not hurry, but it does not forget. It keeps its books in layers. What the land has kept in your layers belongs to everyone in this county who needs water to live. That is not your private fortune to sell to a man who will price it against their thirst. It is a trust. You are the steward of it." He looked at her with his pale eyes and said, "But you are allowed to charge for the labor." She had been thinking the same thing, and hearing him say it made it settled. She spent 2 days preparing, and she called every member of the Grange on the 3rd day herself from the truck, parked at the county road junction, using the cell signal that came in strongest at that particular spot. She told them there would be a meeting on Saturday at the Grange Hall and that she had something to say about the water situation. She did not say what. Harlow Brant heard about the meeting in the way that Harlow Brant heard about things in Harlan Crossing, which was through the ordinary infrastructure of small-town information exchange that he had spent 2 years cultivating. And he arrived at the Grange on Saturday in the linen blazer with his partner and his folder and his number, expecting to provide the afternoon's resolution. He sat up at the head of the table. He arranged his materials. When Delia came in, she looked at him occupying the head of the table, and she took a chair along the side, the way you take a position from which you can see the whole room, and she waited until the hall was full. Brant spoke first because the room was accustomed to him speaking first, and he spoke well in the measured, benevolent cadence of a man delivering relief, outlining the consortium's water infrastructure plan, the distribution network, the assessed fees, the supply guarantees, framing it as community partnership, while the numbers in the small print, which he did not read aloud, defined a rate structure that would cost the average Carver County farm operation between $4,000 and $7,000 annually in perpetuity for water they had previously accessed freely from the public aquifer. He was practiced and he was fluent, and several people in the room were nodding because the drought was in its 7th week, and nods are cheaper in the 8th week of a drought than they are in a wet year. He invited questions. Delia raised her hand. He acknowledged her with his professional warmth, with the particular grace of a man who is confident he is managing the room. She stood and she said, "Mr. Brant, when you quoted the recharge flow rate for the northeast corner of my property last Tuesday, were you working from a survey you commissioned or from data collected on my land without my permission?" He paused for one beat, a very small pause, but she had been watching for it and the room had been watching her watch for it, and the pause was its own answer. He said that geological analysis in the county was necessarily based on multiple data points. She said, "You quoted me a figure of 41 gallons per minute at 14 feet on a parcel that has no filed permits and no disclosed tests, and that I have never given your company or your consortium permission to access. I'd like to know when you were on my land and who let you in." The room had changed. The temperature of a room changes in a particular way when a piece of information arrives that reconfigures everything prior, and this was that kind of piece of information, and the room felt it change the way you feel a pressure shift in the air before weather. Brant recovered and said that he would be glad to discuss any jurisdictional concerns in the appropriate forum, and that today's conversation was about solutions for the community, and he smiled the professional smile. Delia sat down and said, "I agree. Let me offer one." She had a 1-page summary she had written by hand, and Cale Prewitt's older sister, 17 years old, and in possession of a working printer at the school library, had printed 60 copies of that morning, and Cale was standing at the back of the room with the copies, and Delia nodded at him, and he walked them down the rows with the seriousness of a child who has been waiting weeks for his exact role in a moment to arrive. The summary outlined a community water access arrangement. The aquifer connection on her parcel would supply a shared distribution line to the 16 operations along the eastern margin and the 3 farms on the county road that had gone to surface sources. The cost to each participating farm for the connection infrastructure would be $340 per household, which was the actual cost of materials divided by participating households with no markup, and the ongoing maintenance contribution would be $11 per month, which was the actual cost of pump maintenance over a projected 5-year period divided by participating members. There would be no consortium. There would be no distribution fee. The water was from the public aquifer, and it would go to the public at cost, not at profit. She was not giving it away, she said to the room, because she had spent 2.5 years on that land, and she had earned what she had found, and she was not ashamed of that. But what she had found belonged to the county the way all water in a drought belongs to the county, and she was asking for labor and materials in return for making it accessible, not for the water itself, which was not hers to sell. The room was quiet for long enough that the only sound was the August heat pressing against the Grange Hall roof. Then Marvin Solis, who farmed 240 acres on the county road's South Fork, and who had at the Harlan Crossing feed store in the spring of Delia's first year, said with the amusement of a man who has lived in a place long enough to feel entitled to its verdicts, that the girl from the eastern margin had bought herself the county's best-known monument to failure, took his hat off his knee, and held it in both hands, and looked at the floor, and then looked at her, and said, "I'd like to be first on that list, if you'll have me." Brant said, with the remainder of his professional composure, that this was a charitable gesture, but that the infrastructure required for a community distribution system of this kind fell under County Water Authority guidelines, and that there would be permit requirements, and he happened to have relationships with the relevant parties and would be glad to facilitate. Delia said, "I filed the permits on Thursday." The permits had cost her $112 and 4 hours in the county office, and were approved the same afternoon, because a 14-foot residential well on a 7-acre private parcel connected to an existing aquifer was exactly the kind of permit that took 4 hours to approve. She had the approval in her jacket pocket. She took it out and set it on the table in front of Brant's folder. He looked at it. He looked at her. He picked up his folder, and he closed it with one neat motion, and he stood, and he said something about wishing the community well, and it was the most honest thing he had said all day, because he meant it in the precise way that people wish things well that they have decided are no longer their problem, and he and his partner walked out of the Grange Hall, and the sound of their truck on the gravel settled into the distance, and the room did not watch them go, because the room was already talking to Delia. The rains came 11 days later, not a breaking rain, but a slow, sustained 3-day fall that soaked into the ground the way water enters a sponge, with the patience of things that have been waiting for the right conditions, and the creek that ran through Harlan Crossing found itself again, running first as a seep, and then as a trickle, and then as a proper, modest stream, and Carver County began the slow arithmetic of recovery that follows every drought, the recalculation of what you have, what you've lost, and what, if you were careful and fortunate, you managed to keep. The community water line along the eastern margin was completed in late September, a shared weekend project that involved 17 households and 4 borrowed trenching tools and a quantity of donated labor that exceeded the original estimate by 40% in the best possible way, meaning it was done in 2 weekends instead of 4. And when the pump ran for the first time and water came through the test tap at the Prewitt property, Cale Prewitt stood under it with his mouth open for a moment, and his mother put her hand over her eyes, the way people do when they are grateful, past the point of speaking. Przemek Dobrowolski came to the eastern margin field on the first cool morning in October, the kind of morning that carries the season's turn in it, the smell of frost coming, the light going amber, the legume cover having done its third season's work on the clay pan, and the south 2 acres showing in the morning sun, the dark crumble of a soil coming back from a long suppression. He stood at the fence and looked at it for a long time. Delia came out of the tent, which she had replaced that summer, with a small timber frame structure of 400 square feet. She had built herself over 6 weekends with Cale's older brother and Marvin Solis's son, who had shown up with his truck and his framing nailer the first Saturday without being asked. Przemek watched her come across the field, and he said, "Your father was a man who kept things in layers." She said she supposed that was right. He said, "You are the same." She did not say anything to that. He looked at the field again, and he said, "The land does not hurry, but it does not forget. It kept your layers. You were patient enough to read them." He nodded once as if to conclude something that did not need a longer conclusion, and then he turned and walked back down the county road toward his 40 acres, his rubber boots loud on the gravel in the October quiet. She stood in the middle of the 7 acres for a while after he had gone and did the numbers one more time, not from anxiety, but from the satisfaction of an arithmetic that had finally resolved cleanly. She had arrived with $11,000, and she had spent all but $412 of it in the first 2 years. She had a water right, and a remediated 2 acres, and a community supply arrangement, and a small timber frame house, and a contract for next season's specialty crop that represented her first real income, and she had none of the things she had arrived without, which is to say, she had no loneliness of the absolute kind, no sense that her assessment of the situation had been wrong, no debt, no obligation to Harlow Brant, no need to explain herself to any person in Harlan Crossing, and no desire to be anywhere else. The field was not the monument to failure it had been named. It was 7 acres of eastern margin ground that had been holding its patients underground for decades, keeping its books in layers the way her father had apparently kept his, in deep, silent reserves that only paid out if you were willing to put yourself close enough to the ground to read what was written there. Ruth Ann had given it to her as a last insult, and it had turned out to be the only honest thing anyone had given her in years. A piece of land that asked only to be understood. She had understood it. That was the whole story. That was enough.